Morning here in the UK, so good morning to people this side of the ocean, and good evening to people who might be on the other side of the world. Welcome to you all. This is the fourth in the Gobi webinar series. Today we are going to be focusing on bioregionalisation. First of all, though, apologies that we're starting slightly late. We had some technical glitches at our end, but thank you for bearing with us. Before we get started, for those of you who don't know Gobi, we are the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative. We are an international network of organisations that work to advance the scientific basis for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity. Back in 2016, we were very fortunate to secure a 5-year grant from Germany's International Climate Initiative, ICI, which involves a subset of the Gobi partners who are all working on various aspects of marine biodiversity research. Our 5-year work programme concludes next spring. So we are holding these webinars to share our results and our findings with you in the absence of any in-person meetings this year. As I said earlier, this is now session number 4, and I'm very pleased to welcome Piers Dunstan from CSIRO in Australia, who, along with his team, have been working on developing a bioregionalisation for the Indian Ocean and Southwest Pacific Ocean that covers both the Benthic and the Pelagic realms. Piers is the team leader for Marine Biodiversity Risk and Management in the Oceans and Atmosphere Department at CSIRO. And well, it just remains for me to hand over to you, Piers. So if you'd like to share your screen, I will get rid of mine.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along. I'll share my screen now. Just confirm you're able to see that. Is that correct?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Excellent. Good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. I'm going to give a presentation on the work that we've done as part of the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative project, and we developed regional biogeographies for the Indian and Southwest Pacific Oceans. First of all, as Vicky said, the work was funded through the IKI, International Climate Initiative, that was funded by the German government. And I should also acknowledge right at the start that we had a lot of collaborators as part of this project. So we worked with my colleagues Donna Hayes and Skip Woolley from CSIRO, but also a really large number of people who participated in the workshops and the reviews of the work that we did over the last several years to develop these bioregionalizations and other products that we've developed as part of this work. And they represent people from most of the coastal states of the Indian Ocean and the Southwest Pacific. And all of them were able to contribute their expertise and understanding of the different systems that were in those ocean basins and also around the areas where they actually lived and worked as part of the work, their work. And everyone was able to contribute that, which was a really impressive amount of work. And here, just to show you, here's just the pictures we took of some of the workshops that we did and all the participants at those workshops. So to get down to it, the aims of this project, and really what we were trying to do was we were trying to create a harmonized bioregionalization for the Southwest Pacific and the Indian Ocean that reflected both the existing efforts that have occurred and also the new information that has become available. And I think it's important to really clearly state that there have been numerous previous bioregionalizations, but quite often they all show slightly different patterns or quite divergent patterns. What we were trying to do as part of this work was really harmonize all of those efforts to align the boundaries and the description by incorporating all the different sorts of information that's available. And so this project has described the boundaries. It has descriptions for each of the provinces that we've described as part of the bioregions. And it also has a description of a conceptual model for each of these provinces. And I'll describe that in a little bit more detail in a moment. The timeline and process that we worked through really started in June 2016, where we started to collect data from a whole heap of different sources. We then worked through an expert workshop looking at statistical bioregionalizations and developed some outputs out of that that were used by the expert workshops. We then had a preliminary regional workshop for both the Southwest Pacific and the Indian Ocean, where we invited someone from every one of the coastal states of the Indian Ocean and the Southwest Pacific. And we really did try and pull as much diversity of expertise together as we possibly could. We went through that workshop, and then myself and my colleagues at CSIRO came back and worked for a significant amount of time on the preparation of a draft bioregionalisation. And we also worked through and consulted a number of external stakeholders as part of that process to clear up points that were not clear as part of the workshop. Then in 2019, we came back and ran some workshops, some final workshops for the Southwest Pacific and Indian Ocean. And in those workshops, we tried to get the same people back where possible to review the work that they did and to talk about any changes that they thought they needed to see. But we also got quite a lot of new people coming in and contributing their expertise as part of that. And so over the last year, we've prepared all of the outputs, prepared all of the reports and products that have been produced as part of this project. Why are we doing this? Well, I think that one thing that's really clear is that there are many different approaches right now to bioregionalisation, and there's a need to harmonise these to reduce confusion. So there's lots and lots of different pelagic regionalisations, and there's quite a few benthic ocean regionalisations as well. So it's just really to try and harmonise things to reduce confusion and produce a synthesis product that can be used across a very wide geographic scope. The other thing is that bioregions and ecoregions form the basis of an ecosystem approach. And the results from these workshops will be useful in the management inside national jurisdictions and also in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And importantly, different jurisdictions that share the same bioregion may find it useful to use this information to cooperate on the management of shared resources. And this is quite an important one, because what we often see is a particular jurisdiction will come up with its own description of biodiversity within the area it is responsible for, and that description won't necessarily go across a boundary. And so what we end up seeing is two quite different sort of descriptions and provincial boundaries, bioregional boundaries across management boundaries, and we try to harmonise those wherever possible. As an example of that idea of an ecosystem approach, I just wanted to sort of draw your attention to some of the work that's been done in the North Atlantic Fisheries Organisation, where they've started to think about how they can use what they're calling bioregions and ecosystem production units as part of their ecosystem-based management for fisheries. And it's an important thing where they're trying to use the boundaries and the descriptions of the ecosystems within those boundaries to prioritize different sorts of management in different locations. And they've got quite distinct descriptions of what they mean by a bioregion, an ecosystem production unit, and even an ecoregion. And those descriptions scale down in smaller and smaller scales. What we've done is we've also we've sort of looked at that and harmonized it with some work that CSIRO did many, many years ago now in the description of biodiversity around Australia. And that particular paper set up a framework for describing the scales at which you expect to see biodiversity varying, and the sorts of things that you expected to see within those scales. So we had two separate workshops that dealt with different ocean basins, with quite different people in them. And then within each workshop, we described the large marine regions, the proportion of the very large scale proportions of the basins where we're really seeing very long-term patterns occurring, and the provinces, which are places that have quite distinct flora or fauna as part of the evolutionary process. So really those two scales that we really focused on were the large marine regions and the provinces. And within that, something that is much more focused around direct management would be things like the geomorphic types and the habitats that you would expect to see nested within those broader provincial scales. But as I said, we only focused on the large marine regions and the provinces in our work. And the data sets that we use to describe these, it's quite a diverse set of data sets. These are just the regional data sets that we used. But obviously, a lot of the people who came to the workshops brought their own data, their own expertise and their own information and contributed as part of that. But I just wanted to point out that we did actually pick up a lot of the different sorts of existing work and existing provincial analysis that has been done before, and start showing those on the right there of all the different sorts of different existing regionalizations that we actually picked up and used. Now, I talked right at the start about this idea of a conceptual model, and it's one of the key tools that we use as part of our risk assessment and management process within CSIRO. And what the conceptual models do is they represent a working hypothesis for how an ecosystem should work. They identify the components and processes within that system. They document the assumptions about how these are actually linked with each other. They identify the links between the ecosystem and anthropogenic pressures, and they also identify places where there are knowledge gaps or uncertainty. And we've used these sorts of models in a wide variety of circumstances. This is just a coral reef example that we produced for the Great Barrier Reef as part of the management for that particular system. And we can analyze these models to start to describe the dynamics of how a particular place, a location might respond to different sorts of pressures. And we can also start to use them as a preliminary form of risk assessment. And what we have done around Australia, which gives us a lot of confidence in these sorts of models, is build, in this particular example, we're showing the pelagic ecosystem models all around Australia, and they all share some very strong similarities with each other and very strong dynamic equivalence. So what we feel that we can do is we can actually use very similar sorts of models in a number of different locations and modify them slightly, or perhaps in a significant way if necessary, to actually describe the dynamics of different parts of the world's oceans. And so what we're talking about really is a place-based form of ecosystem management, where we can describe the biodiversity of a location through the bioregional provinces, but we can also describe how we think the most important ecosystems within that province also operate, which gives us a much more dynamic way of operating it, and allows us to really start to take an ecosystem approach to thinking about how we might manage that biodiversity. Now, to give you an idea of the scales that we worked at, I just thought I'd show the two boundaries of the areas that we described. The first in the Southwest Pacific, and that was very much based on the EBSA, ecologically or biologically significant areas work that was done in 2011, which used a very, very similar boundary to this. And in the Indian Ocean, again, we really used the same boundary that had been used for the Indian Ocean ecologically or biologically significant areas workshop that was run by the CBD for the boundaries for the areas that we described here. So to get now to just talk through really the results of the work that we've done. And in the Southwest Pacific, we described, in the Pelagic area, we described 9 large marine regional provinces. And these were very closely linked to the Longhurst provinces that have been previously described. Sorry, the Longhurst regions. And then also we used quite similar sorts of provincial boundaries as well. In the Benthic, you can see there's quite a big difference. Unlike the Pelagic region, we only described 4 different large marine regions for the Benthic area in the Southwest Pacific, but we had 35 provincial areas across that particular area, across that ocean basin. The Indian Ocean shows similar sorts of dynamics to a certain extent. So we have for large marine regions, we have 8 pelagic large marine regions and 14 provinces. And in the Benthic, we have 5 large marine regions, but we have 76 provinces. And a real reason for this is that we're dealing with two continental boundaries for the Indian Ocean, whereas though in the Pacific we only dealt with 1 continental boundary. So in the Pacific we only dealt with the continental boundary on Australia and Papua New Guinea, and to a certain extent New Zealand. But in the Indian Ocean we had to include the continental boundaries for Australia and Indonesia, India and Sri Lanka, and then all down the east coast of Africa. And that what we can really see demonstrated here is that when you include an increasing number of coastal areas, that rapidly increases the number of provinces that you have to consider. So just going through the outputs now of the work, so for the Indian Ocean, the pelagic provinces, and what we're showing here is the large marine regions are shown in the outline and named, and the provinces are coloured different colours. So you can see here that there's, in terms of the pelagic bioregions, there's a very strong north-south separation, and then quite a strong, again, north-south separation, but particularly along the coasts of Australia and Africa. And then in the tropical regions, there's a longitudinal rather separation as well between the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Western Indian Ocean. For the Benthic provinces, it shows a similar sort of pattern where what we're seeing is a relatively uniform southern ocean that extends across a very wide longitudinal boundary. But then when you move north, you start to see more and more longitudinal patterning occurring. So you're getting differences between the Eastern and Western Indian Ocean in a tropical area, where you're not seeing those differences as profoundly or as strongly in the subtropical and subpolar regions. What's really clear looking at this here is you can see how much more complicated the provincial structure, which is each of the different coloured sort of squares, is compared to the pelagic provincial structure. It's very, very clear, at least from this particular diagram shows it quite well, that we get a lot more variation in biodiversity in the coastal, on the continental shelf, than we do as we move off the continental shelf. And so as soon as we start to move off the continental shelf, and in particular get down into the bathyl and abyssal areas, we start to see biodiversity distributed much greater distances, and much uniformly within those basins. So we see real effects of basins occurring, and separation by large-scale topographic features such as ridges and seamount chains, and they really contribute to a lot of the spatial patterning that we were able to describe as part of this process. The deep the lack of variation in the deep ocean is one of the emerging themes of a lot of deep ocean research, where we can see that a lot of the evolution of biodiversity in the world's oceans is driven on the continental boundaries, and then as it moves off, it distributes over very, very broad areas as it evolves in those deep ocean basins, and becomes very, very broadly distributed in places where there's actually very little environmental variation. And so that's the other key thing here, is that deep oceans have much less environmental variation. So moving on to the Pacific, and the Pacific has a similar sort of pattern that emerges for the pelagic regions, rather. In the subtropical regions and around the subantarctic, we are seeing very broad latitudinal patterns emerging that go over very long longitudinal areas, with the exception, as you can see here, for New Zealand, where some of the topographic features of New Zealand actually drive a lot of the differences in ocean dynamics. But then as we move north, we start to see more and more patterning occurring across longitudinal gradients. And that's really a fairly, as I said, the Indian and Pacific share quite a similar sort of pattern emerging here. The Pacific's interesting, of course, as well, because it has a very strong El Nino La Nina dynamic, which actually gets shown up in the bioregionalisation, and picks up a lot of those patterns where we see really discrete parts of the world's oceans operating in quite a different dynamic sort of fashion. Again, the benthic regions show a similar pattern, but there are fairly profound differences. It's showing the same sort of pattern at the subpolar regions, where we're not seeing the same sort of longitudinal variation. And as you move further north into the tropics, you start to see more and more longitudinal variation. But what's really clear is in the Pacific, the island chains and the atolls actually really affect the way that biodiversity is moved from one part of the world's ocean to another part. It's more pronounced in the Pacific than it is in the Indian Ocean to a certain extent, because even though the Indian Ocean, the areas are quite large, there's not a lot of islands in between, at least in the shallower areas, to actually pick up the species as they move through and migrate between different islands and locations. But the Pacific shows a very, very strong gradient from west to east of decreasing biodiversity across a wide range of species, particularly for the species on the continental shelves or the areas above 200 meters. So we're really talking about those tropical corals and fish species. One of the emerging really, really clear themes as part of this work is that the coral triangle for both the Indian and Pacific Ocean is a real center of diversity. And we really do see that effect very, very strongly as we move away from the coral triangle into either the Indian or the Pacific Ocean, that you really do see strong gradients of decreasing species richness across those gradients. So that's the very broad outline of the work around that we've produced in terms of just the spatial pattern of biodiversity. And it does show that we see quite different patterns in the pelagic and the benthic bioregions. But those broad patterns are actually consistent in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Oceans. And we can see that those ocean basins across the scales that we're talking about here are actually operating in a fairly similar way, which is probably something that we should actually expect to see. Within the work that we've done, what we did then is, of course, go into every single one of those provinces. And there's well over 150 provinces that we've described as part of this work. And every single one of those provinces has obviously a description of the spatial boundaries. it has a description of the species and ecosystems found in that region. Most of the systems have a description of the qualitative model of the ecosystem that dominates that particular area. Obviously, we couldn't describe all of the ecosystems within a particular bioregion, but what we did as part of this work was talk to the people that were from that area and actually ask them what was the most important ecosystem in that area, and then worked with them to describe that ecosystem, all the different components that were associated with it, and the different sorts of pressures that we ended up seeing coming in on those particular components. And we see a real difference across that I'll talk about in a moment. And then finally, for every one of those systems where we were able to describe a qualitative model, we were able to do an analysis that described the potential cumulative impacts of pressures that were found in those provinces. So it described how the different pressures might actually act on the different ecosystems that were described. As an example of a qualitative model, this is the one that we developed for the Coral Sea and the Western Indo-Pacific Benthic area, Benthic region. When we talked here, it was really clear that it was a coral reef ecosystem, and so what we described then was we took a coral reef ecosystem model that we had developed earlier and worked through and decided, are each of these ecosystem components actually present in that location, and what are the big pressures that are occurring here, and that's an important part of it. So for this particular system, the pressures are obviously increasing temperature, artisanal fisheries, line fisheries, marine debris, and cyclones. And those were the main pressures that the people who had come from that area thought were the most important. I think it's, one of the things that's really clear is that you get quite a different sort of set of pressures occurring in places where there's more build-up of people and more sort of human activity in different locations. The Coral Sea in the Western Indo-Pacific Shelf actually has quite a low population density on it, so there's not a lot of impacts of high density of people in those locations. But in some places, particularly in Africa and Indonesia, we see a lot of things like nutrient discharge, increases in nutrient, increases in sedimentation actually showing up as being really important for those particular ecosystems. And then for every one of those, as I said, for every one of those ecosystems, and there are hundreds of these ecosystem descriptions, so I can't go through them all this evening. But for every one of these, we have a table that looks like this, where you can see listed across on the y-axis in the vertical is each of the ecosystem components, and then along the bottom on the x-axis as each of the pressures, and not only each pressure separately by itself, but particular combinations of pressures. So you can see here that artisanal fisheries affects a whole heap of different things. It affects corals. So artisanal fisheries is the second column from the left, and it actually impacts on predators, on turf algae, on pelagic filter feeders, on corals. But that situation, so you can see, and then that shows you there. The red shows you where something is having a negative impact, and the blue where something is where those particular pressures are actually causing a positive change in the system. And as you add more and more pressures, you can see that the dynamics and the components of the ecosystems that are impacted change depending upon which particular combination of pressures is actually impacting the system. And so we can start to think then about, okay, how could we use this information to start to modify how we're managing this system, and could we actually start to change the dynamics of the system to allow us to try and maximize or try and improve the overall biodiversity of the system and the overall ecosystem function. It's a really important tool that starts to move us down that path of risk assessment and starts to allow us to think about how we can manage the different sorts of pressures and the combinations of pressures that we're seeing in different locations. What I also did was looked at the total number of pressures for any particular set of, for all of the bioregional provinces. For the continental shelves, obviously, the two things that were, well, really the three things that were the most important was increases in temperature through climate change, and then artisanal and line fisheries. And those were the three things that really came out as being the most important. But then straight after that, what you can start to see is that we're starting to see the impacts of land use, sedimentation, land clearing occur, and then pollution, all starting to show up as really quite important in a large number of bioregions on the continental shelves around the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. And then cyclones are in there as well as another potential. And then there's a sequence of other sorts of pressures and changes that are occurring that were identified as being important for different systems. In the pelagic realm, it's actually quite similar. What we see is pelagic fisheries and temperature, increases in pelagic fisheries, increases in temperature as being really important components of the systems and all the different pressures that were identified on them in both the Pacific Ocean and also the Indian Ocean. And then in the deep ocean, it's a little bit different in the deep ocean. In the deep ocean, what we see is climate change really coming out as the dominant pressure of concern in the deep ocean. And don't forget, this is not just areas like seamounts in the deep ocean. This is also the abyssal areas, the deep bathyl areas that may not necessarily have things like stony corals on them. It has a whole heap of other species associated with them in those particular locations. There are a lot of people who talked about seafloor mining and the potential of seafloor mining to impact the different ecosystems that were in locations, and then also things like demersal trawl and other forms of climate change and pollution were also identified as things that could really influence those deep sea ecosystems. So that's just an overview of the sorts of pressures that were identified as part of in each of those provinces for in those bioregional provinces. That gives you an idea of what's the most important things that people are identifying just purely by the count of the number of provinces where that occurred. So wrapping up, where to from here? Our results, we're working through the process of getting our results ready for a peer-reviewed journal, and we're actually already engaging with governments in international organisations on the use of the methods and the outputs. We are working at the moment with the International Seabed Authority to use similar sorts of qualitative models to begin a preliminary risk assessment for the impacts of deep sea sulfide mining, and also on the effects for other forms of polymetallic nodules and crusts as potential mining, and the impacts on ecosystems as a result of that. We're working on the development of a number of projects in the Indian Ocean that will use the outputs of this work and also the qualitative models to begin both an ecosystem approach to management, thinking about protected areas, and also thinking about how we might manage other sorts of activities that are occurring. The work actually has a lot of utility in planning and in environmental impact assessments. So as I said, we're working with the ISA on cumulative impacts. We're also working with the FAO using the same sorts of methodologies on cumulative impacts as well. And as I noted before, the work has a large potential for using the outputs of this work to plan for marine protected areas and other forms of management in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you very much, and happy to take questions if anyone has them. Thank you.
Thank you, Piers. the floor is now open for questions. We normally do this using the Q&A facility in the Zoom window, so via text, but we're a reasonably small group this morning, so if anyone does have a question that they want to ask, we can do it verbally. You should be able to find a button to raise your hand through the chat window, but perhaps I can kick off. Piers, I know that I've seen the results of your work a number of times, and every time I see them, I'm always amazed by how complicated it is and how much work has gone into this. So a couple of questions related to that, if I might. The first one is about data availability. I mean, to me, as you know, the uninitiated when it comes to bioregionalisation, it looks like you need a massive amount of data to do that work. But is that really the case? And what's the potential for applying this sort of methodology to areas of the ocean where actually data availability is very poor?
I think to a certain extent, what we relied on, and as you're quite right, it does have a lot of data in it. But what we did do is we really relied a lot on people's expertise to interpret the information that they had and their understanding of the way that biodiversity was distributed across wide ranges of areas. So a good example of a data poor area is obviously the deep sea abyssal areas, and in particular, you know, the deep sea abyssal areas of both the Indian and Pacific actually have very low rates of collection of data. But what we were able to do was use the people who attended the workshops to interpret the data that they had in a way that was their understanding of the most likely patterns of biodiversity in those areas. And undoubtedly what we will see is as we collect more information and more data, some of those boundaries are going to change because we'll get a better understanding of the distribution of biodiversity. But what we've described here is useful for is just describing that first cut pattern of saying this is where we believe things are occurring, and now it's a process of reviewing that. And it's one of the things that we've talked about a lot, actually, about using the outputs of this work as essentially, from a statistical point of view, it's a prior of what you might do for future implementation. So you can actually use this information to you can update the boundaries as new information becomes available.
Great, thank you. That actually leads me very neatly to a couple of questions that David popped up on the chat. But David, perhaps it would be better if you asked them verbally.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks, Piers. Actually, I put 3 up, but Piers, you've answered the one on the ISA. Thank you very much. So the 2 questions I had really from the presentation, firstly, is what is the shelf life of this work? You've consolidated lots of previous efforts into biogeographies and come up with a consensus on how those areas ought to be modified. But I would just wondered when that would need to be revisited again to either reconfirm or validate the synthesis that you've put together. And then a second question really related to the pelagic provinces. How do your pelagic provinces account for vertical differences within the water column? Because I can see very much that there's a geographic spread, if you like, an aerial spread, but there must be differences in the water column as well. And I can see that causing all kinds of complications. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, David. So just going to the water column question first, I think what we did was we realized very early on that if we thought there was very little data for the abyss in the oceans, for benthic species living in the abyss in the oceans, there is an order of magnitude less for any of the mesopelagic information. So essentially we decided that we couldn't even take a guess at that particular point in time, and that the work that had only recently been done in terms of a mesopelagic regionalisation was probably the best thing that could be looked at. So what we did for the pelagic was we limited ourselves really to the mixing layer. So we said, you know, these are the regions where we're seeing that essentially the epipelagic species occurring. above the mixing layer. And in that way, we sidestepped the problem that you're talking about. It's a limit of the work that we have done. But importantly, it also reflects the major uses of those particular areas. So we know in terms of the use of the epipelagic, that's primarily, at least for the open ocean, for the open ocean basins, that's primarily for pelagic fisheries, and primarily within those pelagic fisheries for tuna-based fisheries. And they really are primarily epipelagic feeders. They do go lower than that, but they're feeding primarily in that epipelagic region. So I think that made us quite comfortable in sort of our understanding of where we managed to get to and why we managed to get to that location. In terms of how long it takes to update, I think that the update process is ongoing. We actually used a lot of sort of official regionalizations within the work that we did, but that also got updated as part of the process. So South Africa provided a lot of their regionalizations that they have used, but also as part of this Gobi process, actually updated their regionalizations and slightly changed the way that they described it and the boundaries around them. We did use a similar sort of thing in Australia. I think that realistically, updating these on a more frequent basis than every decade would not be particularly effective, and really is going to be the point at which we get better information and better understanding and more cruises, more surveys occurring. I suppose one thing that that is ongoing at the moment is the second Indian Ocean cruise organised by the IOC and the IODE. And so that will probably provide a significant amount of new information that could be used in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Piers. That leads me very neatly onto a question I think that Chris had about data types. Chris?
Hello, Piers. Thanks for that. And you may have touched upon what I'm about to ask you already, but I'm aware that in your models you've used very comprehensive data sets already, you know, global coverage data sets, say, of echinoderms and that sort of thing. I was just wondering what kinds of data you might want or desire for future updates of this. Are you looking for similar global coverage data sets of particular taxa, or would smaller data sets of multiple taxa work for you? And if anybody had the sorts of data that you require, how would they feed into your, you know, how would they get them to you so that you could use them?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I think one of the things that we did very early on was we looked at the different sorts of approaches that you could use for a statistical bioregionalisation, and that triggered a lot of work that is still ongoing in adapting some of the methods that have been developed so that it could use a wide variety of data types. So really, anywhere there's a record of the occurrence of a species or an abundance of a particular species in a particular location, we're able to use that information to start to update the layers and the analysis that we've done for this. That being said, I think it would take, for at least for the analysis at this scale, it would take quite a significant amount of new information to actually change the outputs that we have produced here. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we couldn't start thinking about those finer scale patterns of biodiversity that I talked about in the presentation, where we stopped at the provincial areas, but we could actually go down to the geomorphic types and the habitats. And if we went down to those scales, then really individual data sets that people had about particular areas become actually incredibly important in describing the finer scale variation of biodiversity and how it might vary across quite small scales instead of those very, very large basin scales. Thanks.
Great. I see no other questions coming in. No one's got their hand up. Nothing's coming in on the chat. So Piers, I think people have let you off very lightly today, but thank you for the presentation. I think really it just remains for me just to give a bit of a punt for our next webinar. So bear with me while I work the buttons. So our next event in the Gobi webinar series is in the new year, Wednesday 13th of January, where our colleagues at the Malviva Foundation will be talking about their work in promoting a regional governance model for the Costa Rica Thermal Dome. So please join us then if you can. Piers, thank you again for an excellent presentation. Thanks to our audience for bearing with us today and for joining us, and wishing you all a very good break over the Christmas period, and we will see you in January.
Thank you.